I hope you've all got yourself a nice hot cup of tea, because it's time to talk about how I made my Papercut animated film, Mrs. Wilkins and Her Magic Handbag. So, where did it all begin? Well, actually it begins many, many years before I was born. In fact, back in the 1940s, when the real-life Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins were born. So these are my actual grandparents in real life. And of course, they were a big influence on me growing up. And it only made sense when my grandfather unfortunately passed away when I was about 13, was to commemorate the love I had for my grandparents in the form of a picture book. So one day in sixth form, when I was in the art room, I really wasn't in the mood for painting that day, and suddenly this story entered my head from nowhere, and I felt the need to start writing. So I got my pen, got my paper, and started writing down this poem, and nothing had ever come to me so quickly in my life. I wrote the entire narration of the film of Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag in just 20 minutes, and I hardly changed any of it. I decided to write it as a picture book. So this is the very, very original Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag that I did back in 2018. When I was at university, I had it in me, I thought, I need to make Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag into a film, but I don't want to make it look like my other films, Boing Boing the Bouncing Sheep and No Man's Land. I thought I need to make this look different, so I decided I would make this film completely out of paper and animated on something called a multiplane camera. Now, I bet you're wondering, what on earth is a multiplane camera? Now, this was something that was developed by the Walt Disney Animation Studios way back in the 1930s. So Walt Disney had experimented with 2D animation, obviously with the creation of the world famous Mickey Mouse. Now, this led on to an Academy Award winning short film called The Old Mill. Now, The Old Mill wasn't shot all flat like normal hand-drawn animation was. This used layers of glass. Each panel of glass had a different picture of that scene on, so this was revolutionary at the time, and it was used all the way throughout Walt Disney's animation career. You can see it in Bambi, you can see it in Pinocchio, and one of the most expensive scenes in the entirety of the film Pinocchio featured this multiplane camera at the very opening with the village. So I was at university, I was in the second year, and it was time to make my first film, which I did as a 1-minute animation, Boing Boing the Bouncing Sheep. It was my first proper foray into the world of stop motion as an adult, but that film had to be limited to just 1 minute in length, and I thought, I can't do Mrs. Wilkins in just 1 minute, nor could I do No Man's Land, which had also been in my head for over 7 or 8 years at this point. I had to wait to the final year of university, and there I was told, Leo, you can only do one project, you've only got time to do one, and I thought, well, I have to do No Man's Land, but then I thought, no, I'm going to do 2. So I got to it. Firstly, with every animation I ever make, I always start by doing some rough thumbnail sketches. And here is a very tatty, very old sketchbook of mine. Now here are all my thumbnail sketches, okay? So before you do storyboards and start mapping out your story almost as a visual comic strip, I always start with the thumbnails. Now these are very rough drawings. Each one might only take 30 seconds to a minute to quickly rough out and sketch so I can get an idea of the pacing and general look of the film. After thumbnails, I move on to character design. So as you can see, I did lots of different design processes when designing Mrs. Wilkins and her Magic Handbag. Once everything had been drawn out, it was time for me to lay it out as a storyboard. Now this is like the thumbnails but in more detail. It looks like a moving comic strip, and us animators call it an animatic, okay? So it maps it out to the second of roughly how long and what the structure of our film is going to look like. Once I sorted the animatic out, I showed it around, got lots of feedback from lots of people. Then it was time for No Man's Land to move on full steam ahead. So Mrs. Wilkins had to be paused for the meantime. Whilst I was spending many days and many hours, many late nights animating away at my stop motion film No Man's Land, when I came home of a weekend, I was on my Cricut maker. Now this is what we use to make our Papercut characters for our animations. I always draw my characters on my iPad Pro originally, and all the props and assets you can see in my film were all hand drawn but digitally on an iPad. Once they've been drawn, I put them through the Cricut software. A Cricut is basically a laser cutting machine but for card and paper, so each individual individual piece was hand cut, just like Mrs. Wilkins' house here. So there are a few challenges to work out when making Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag. How do you make flat pieces of cardboard feel alive? Well, the key part was the very nice lip sync animation for the mouths. So to get my characters to talk, I really had to make lots of different mouth shapes like these. So as you can see, there's Mrs. Wilkins' face, and here are just some of her mouth replacement. But of course, with them being flat, if Mrs. Wilkins was looking at the camera, they'd all have to be facing the camera. But if she turned her head slightly right, I'd have to redraw all of those valves and mouth shapes in a very different direction. Now, when replacing a mouth shape, I would have to get the head and have to take the mouth off, and I disguised the seam line with the glasses and the nose, and each mouth shape was cut out to fit exactly on, so the viewer wouldn't notice any line as I move them on and off the screen. And sometimes I'd have to move up to 24 of these per second. You can see here we've got lots of different mouth shapes. Now you can see Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes are very, 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 very small indeed. So when I had to animate them, I'd have to get a tiny pin and use the end of the pin to move the pupil around. So the body of Mrs. Wilkins was quite interesting. For the joints, they were often blue tacked on to different parts of the body. And there was a very nice bit of invisible thread that would be sat there, which would give me room for motion. Okay, so you can see in the sequence where Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins get married in their flashback, I needed to make them look a bit younger. So my real life Mr. Wilkins, he actually had lovely ginger hair, so I gave him ginger hair for the wedding dance sequence, and Mrs. Wilkins, I gave her darker hair with a lovely cute little bow. They had a wedding dress and obviously the suit for Mr. Wilkins. So when it came to making this film, I always wondered who's going to voice it, but in the end I realised, with it being such a personal story to me, it had to be me to narrate it, so I ended up doing all the voices. So I went in a proper nice sound booth with microphones and recorded all of the dialogue and narration for the film. Then she pulled out the world's biggest banana. Mrs. Wilkins felt like giving up due to all the drama. There's a lot of personal touches in this film because obviously Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins are real people, so I wanted to add as much detail in as I possibly could. For example, my real life Mr. Wilkins was a drummer in a band called Badge, so of course on the drum kit it had to say Badge on it. I always remembered speaking to the real life Mr. Wilkins about what he used to read and collect as a child, and he read an annual called The Eagle. Now, one of the books that Mrs. Wilkins pulls out the bag is a Seagull annual. All the vinyl records and music albums that come onto the screen all have meanings as well. For example, we have Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which was one of my granddad's favourite songs. Then we also have Liberace. My real life dog, also in No Man's Land, was called Archie. Again, Badge, the band that my grandfather was in. And of course this train here, he was very into trains, and that's the Flying Scotsman. All of Mr. Wilkins' 4 grandchildren, all of their initials all spelled the word help. Okay, so if you look at this one here, Help, the Beatles, obviously, we're all big Beatles fans in my family, and here they are, but of course Paul McCartney's trousers have fallen down. We've got the vinyl record of No Man's Land. We also have the vinyl record of Boing Boing the Bouncing Sheep. Now, one thing you might not know is all the music from my films are all written by my massively talented cousin Ewan Woodman. He has written all the music for all 4 of my stop motion animated films so far, and he's also a grandson of Mr. Wilkins. Now this one features my granddad when he was a very young man. Now, my most favourite scene in Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag for animation is when the Spitfire flies across the screen. Now, the Spitfire was filmed on the multiplane camera, using it very effectively. It stayed in the one position. It moved up and down, but it stayed on the middle part of the multiplane. Mr. Wilkins always loved his Spitfires, so I had to throw this in here. And of course, it says PW at the end, which is for Paul Wilkins. So the beach scene in Mrs. Wilkins and a Magic Handbag in the flashback is one of my favourites in the entire film because it's only there for 10 seconds, but it's a real special shot to me. So this required a completely unique lighting setup, but I really wanted to make this meaningful. So my grandparents always enjoyed going to Cornwall on their holiday, so that summer I'd gone to Cornwall and picked up a little bit of sand and ended up gluing that to some cardboard for the beach. The genius of recycling came into play here too. So the sea in the background was actually just a pair pair of jeans with a clear plastic bag on top. The sunshine was a needle-felted ball reused from Boing Boing the Bouncing Sheep. So in animation I really try to recycle and reuse things as and where I can, because you never know when things are going to be useful again. Now, all was going well when making this film. I'd finished No Man's Land, all my time could be devoted to my Papercut animation. But oh dear, I was suddenly told, Leo, you've got to leave in 2 weeks because someone else needed to use the room. It was a race against time to get it finished. I'd had about 2/3 of the film shot, but I still had to shoot at least a minute and a half in less than 2 weeks, which required an insane amount of work. I was probably animating away for 12+ hours a day to make sure it could be to the best possible quality I could do it. Finally, I left the university, having made 3 films whilst I was there, which are all available to watch on my YouTube channel. So if you haven't already, make sure you press subscribe, give this a like and put a comment on what other sorts of videos you might want to see me make here on my YouTube channel. But that wasn't just it. Oh no, it wasn't. I submitted it to the Royal Television Society Awards, and lo and behold, I am very, very proud to have won one for the writing of this film, which I find very fun indeed, because I actually wrote that when I was 16, and to have won an award for that over 5 years later was one of my greatest achievements.
And the winner is Mrs. Wilkins and her magic handbag.
This film I wrote the poem for this film about 4 or 5 years ago for my nan. We'd lost my grandfather, and I wrote a poem about if she could meet him again, and it meant an awful lot to her when I read it to her, because I did it as a picture book originally. And then when I was at university, I had to pick a final film, so I decided to do 2, because I had to get this one out of my system. And I thought the best possible way of doing this was with the voices coming out of little card people. But yeah, I was rather happy with it, and I really appreciate the award, and it really did mean a lot to me, this film, and yeah, thank you.
Mrs. Wilkins also travelled to London at the British Film Institute on the South Bank Centre, which was a fantastic experience indeed, seeing it on the big screen at such a prestigious place. So I took Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins along with me for the ride, again using my Cricut maker and taking them with me to London. Now, I feel there's only one way to end this video talking about the making of the film, and I believe that is probably to watch the film itself. So remember, get that cup of tea, start sipping away, and enjoy the show.
Mrs. Wilkins had lost Mr. Wilkins a long time ago. Where had he gone? She didn't know. Her heart grew sad and weak because she missed his soft kiss upon her cheek. She was worried the memories she had made might disappear into dust and start to fade. Like the time they went to the beach, or the time they went to France. Like the trip to the picture house, and their first wedding dance. One day, Mrs. Wilkins decided enough was enough, so she went to look through her stuff. She put her hand in her bag where her lost things usually were, but she pulled out a little dog, who gave a little grrr. "He has to be in here somewhere," Mrs. Wilkins said with a sigh. But then she pulled out his favourite book and his model toy that could fly. Next came his drum kit and his big shiny car. Mrs. Wilkins started going, completely gaga. Next she pulled out a camera, and the world's biggest banana. Mrs. Wilkins felt like giving up, due to all the drama. Mrs. Wilkins looked at the mess and started to frown, so she picked up her bag and stomped into town. Then came her wedding cake and the Eiffel Tower. Then came a rainbow and the world's most beautiful flower. Mrs. Wilkins fell to her knees and felt like giving up, but she put her hand in her bag for one final look. She rummaged for one last time and felt a shiny, bald head. "That's Mr. Wilkins," she smiled and said. Mrs. Wilkins shed a tear and gazed into his eyes. Mr. Wilkins gazed back and said, "True love never dies." "Don't leave me again," Mrs. Wilkins said with cheer. "I never left you in the first place. I've always been right here." They hugged for one last time before he went back to the bag. "Thank you," he said, "for all the good times we've had." Mr. Wilkins jumped back in the bag and vanished in thin air, but Mrs. Wilkins knew she could find him anytime, anywhere.